The dude is disposable, ideological reciprocity in video game criticism. Going over how video games treat women as objects to be defended, but men are disposable because men are often the protagonists, and uh, typically, due to the way uh, games work, the death of the protagonist is irrelevant because it leads to a game over screen. And I could go on and on about how uh, the fact that in most games the protagonist dying is something that can never happen unless it's something built into the story. Because, of course, if the protagonist dies, then the game ends. But that doesn't mean that the game treats men as disposable necessarily. Although there definitely is a an issue with male disposability in our culture. It's part of toxic masculinity. But let's see how this person, who I know next to nothing about, Troy Levitt, uh, let's see how he handles it. So, Troy, take it away.
One of the most common complaints leveled against video games is the widespread use of the damsel in distress trope. From Super Mario to Super Meat Boy. From Ghosts and Goblins to Ghouls and Ghosts. From Final Fight to Final Fantasy. From The Legend of Zelda to Altered Beast. From Prince of Persia to Castlevania. From Double Dragon to Donkey Kong. It is undeniable that many games kick off the action by placing an unfortunate woman in grave danger, and then informing the player that, as the male protagonist, it is his duty to run off and rescue her. Many third-wave gender feminists take issue with this common plot device, claiming that it reinforces harmful stereotypes about the role of women in society. That each time a video game makes the rescue of a captured woman its primary goal, it underscores the notion that women are helpless, weak, and unable to fend for themselves. And, in contrast, that men are strong, powerful, and capable. Some feminists will speak of the subject-object dichotomy, whereby men are the subjects, or the actors, and women are the objects, or the beings which are acted upon. And hence, they say, every time we see this trope in gaming, we see evidence of the patriarchy at work, and proof of how society and media tends to reinforce the dominance of men over women.
So you can already tell by his tone of voice that he doesn't take this kind of criticism seriously. That a video game couldn't possibly reinforce gender stereotypes, or that if they do, that's not a bad thing. But the fact that so many popular video games are based on this damsel in distress trope, this idea that women are weak and in need of being rescued, is a very common and popular one. Whether that is entirely whether that's a bad thing kind of depends on the game itself, how they treat the woman. Obviously, old Mario games and Legend of Zelda, the women in those games were uh, pretty much completely helpless and incapable of doing anything without the aid of the typically male protagonist. Although, of course, Ocarina of Time subverts that pretty handily by having Zelda take the role of a pretty badass ninja type character. But of course, it forces her to cross dress to do that, so, uh, points and detractions all around. That being said, this is the damsel in distress trope is an ancient one. It predates video games by centuries, of course, but it does reinforce this idea that women are helpless and need men to save them, which does reinforce the male dominance of our society. That this is something that's popular even in a lot of like romantic comedies, where you have a woman who needs a man to save her either from her workaholic ways or from some other issue of her own creation or what have you. So, but the damsel in distress trope is popular not because it reinforces gender roles or stereotypes, but because it's classic. It does reinforce gender stereotypes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be used well. And subversions abound.
In several of my other videos about sexism in gaming, I have spoken about the role that ideology plays in shaping how one views the world. I have also talked about how one way to expose ideological viewpoints is simply to give due consideration to the counterpoint. A lot has already been said about what the damsel in distress trope allegedly means for the position of women in society. But what about the obvious reciprocal notion? What does being repeatedly asked to rescue a damsel in distress mean as it relates to men and their role? I'd like to take a moment to consider this position. In so doing, let's use perhaps the most exemplary, and some might say egregious, instance of the damsel trope in all of video gaming. That of the 1983 Laserdisc game Dragon's Lair.
Dragon's Lair, the fantasy adventure where you become a valiant knight on a quest to rescue the fair princess from the clutches of an evil dragon. You control the actions of a
Dragon's Lair is, of course, infamous for being a fairly difficult game. So there's a lot of instances where the guy dies. But the problem is that those aren't actually part of the narrative. This is something Errant Signal has talked about a few times. How, if you look at the narrative of a game like Half-Life or Halo, it's always the protagonist, Gordon Freeman or Master Chief, going from overwhelming battle to overwhelming battle, and despite all odds, emerging victorious, slaying dozens, if not hundreds, of enemies as he goes. But if you actually look at the way it's played, oftentimes someone messes up, the player messes up, or they get overwhelmed and they die and they restart from the last checkpoint. I've been playing Doom 2016 lately off stream, and there have been multiple times where the story of Doom Guy ends with a holographic shield smacking him to death in the back because I forget to check what's behind me. So, this idea that men are disposable is not baked into the narrative. It's a matter of the gameplay, of the way the game works. So, if the gameplay and to bring back an old meme, ludonarrative dissonance. That's what that's one of the things that represents. This idea that if you actually look, like if you watch a stream or a long form let's play of a game like Half-Life 2 or Doom 2016, chances are that narrative of the let's play or the stream will contain dozens of instances of the protagonist of Doom Guy getting overwhelmed and dying. The story ending in some random pit of hell or a mining office or what have you. But that's not the narrative of the story, of the game. The narrative of the game, as it is intended, as it is written, is that Doom Guy makes it through every battle, even if just by the skin of his teeth, and survives. So that's the difference between the disposable male trope and the damsel in distress. Damsel in distress is baked into the narrative of many of these games, but the disposable male isn't baked in because the dude sacrificing his life is not part of the narrative.
Daring adventurer finding his way through the castle of a dark wizard who has enchanted it with treacherous monsters and obstacles.
Here, we see all the ingredients taken to their ridiculous endpoints. So much so that the game is almost a self-parody. Princess Daphne is our damsel in distress. She's completely helpless and highly sexualized. Clearly, her whole existence is to provide motivation for the hero by serving as the ultimate reward.
Right?
Please save me! The cage is locked with a key. The dragon keeps it around his neck. To slay the dragon, use the magic sword.
Normally, the analysis from your average ideological feminist stops right there. We've done all we need to prove the existence of the patriarchy, right? So it's time to move on.
Oh, God, I hate fucking idiots like this who just are like, the patriarchy, without understanding what is actually meant by that. And while, yes, the patriarchy is a term for the male-dominated society we live in, it also indicates how the way our society is structured hurts men too. Either by expecting them to be disposable. That is a part of patriarchy. It's not something a lot of these anti-SJWs, anti-feminists talk about. Toxic masculinity, male disposability, this expectation that men are expected to sacrifice for women or what have you. That is part of that is a strong component of patriarchy. So when you criticize this, you're basically doing the same thing feminists actually do, but you think you're doing something different. Because male disposability is a part of patriarchy. Same with male stoicism and female helplessness. Wow, I had a small heart attack when I saw Vosh in chat, but I know it's not the real Vosh, so, hi there.
But wait a minute. What about our hero? The alliteratively named Dirk the Daring? What's his role in the story? For those of you who have played the game all the way through, you know that Dirk doesn't have a single speaking line in the entire game. He never says an intelligible word. Instead, all he ever does is grunt and yelp and cry out in pain when things go wrong. And oh boy, do things ever go wrong for poor Dirk. In his quest to rescue Princess Daphne, he gets slashed and strangled and burned and mangled and eaten and smacked and drowned and cracked and gassed and crushed and...
But again, that's not part of the narrative. Those are traps that the player falls into. But in the overall narrative of the story, Dirk escapes them and evades them and survives them. This is different from the damsel in distress narrative, which again is the core goal of the story.
Fried and mushed, and so on and so on. When you look through the gaming universe of Dragon's Lair through Dirk's eyes, it quickly becomes apparent that his entire purpose is to die over and over again until he finally gets it right and wins the girl.
Okay, I've never played Dragon's Lair, I'll be totally honest, but unless there's some sort of mechanic baked into the game that lets him die and come back, and that's part of the narrative, which, as far as I'm aware, is not. I've watched at least I've watched both the Nostalgia Critic talk about it because he's a huge fan of the guy who created it, whose name escapes me at present, but he's the guy who did like Anastasia and All Dogs Go to Heaven, a bunch of those classic cartoon movies. Um, uh, and as Dodge already mentioned, the Angry Video Game Nerd talked about it. I don't believe there is any. He's just a regular knight who's trying to rescue the princess. And there are a bunch of difficult traps and monsters you have to come across and defeat. But that's not the narrative. The narrative is that he either easily or by the skin of his teeth defeats the enemies and avoids the traps and eventually gets to and rescues the princess. His death is not part of the narrative. So it's not a case of male disposability, because at no point is he expected to throw his life away for someone else. He's expected to risk it, which is a little bit of male disposability. But if we want to condemn everyone who risks their life for someone else as reinforcing disposability, then we have to throw away most rescue stories, even if they don't do the damsel in distress thing. Like, the idea of risking your life is what makes these stories good. And yeah, he's a silent protagonist. A lot of games, especially from the 80s, had silent protagonists. The fact that Daphne has voice lines at all is amazing for an 80s game. Really only possible because, if I remember correctly, this was a really expensive arcade unit.
So, if Princess Daphne is our damsel in distress, it stands to reason that Dirk the Daring is our disposable dude. And what is our hero's reward for all his agony and personal sacrifice? Why, it is 5 seconds of affection from the princess. That's our Dirk's happy ending. But of course, these complementary tropes aren't unique to the game Dragon's Lair. Anytime you have a game that revolves around a
That looks more like a very grateful princess who is going to reward him quite handsomely for rescuing her, not 5 seconds of affection. But, that doesn't fit your narrative.
damsel in distress, you have the corollary of the dude is disposable when the game is examined from the male hero's perspective. For example, when our friendly little plumber Mario heads off to rescue Princess Peach because she's been captured by Bowser yet again, he too becomes a disposable dude, dedicated to fighting and striving and dying over and over again until he finally...
Holy shit, no! Again, the deaths of Mario, of which there could be many in a Mario game, are not part of the narrative. And if you think that you can make a fun platformer without the risk of death in order to somehow eliminate the disposable male trope, which this isn't a part of, then I applaud your game design skills and look forward to your smash hit game. The only one I can think of, granted platformers aren't really my thing, but Braid kind of has that built in where you can If you mess up, you don't have to die, but that's because it is a time rewind mechanic. So if you mess up, you can catch it in time, you can rewind to not mess up. But this idea that deaths in a video game are the same thing, on the same level, or I'm guessing he's even going to argue above, more important, more harmful than the idea that putting a damsel in distress and having to rescue her is good, then it doesn't make sense. It doesn't. There's no logical glue there, because when you die in a video game, whether it's Mario misjudging a jump, whether it's Zelda getting, or Link, excuse me, getting killed by whatever fucking monster in Legend of Zelda, whether it's Gordon Freeman getting overwhelmed by head crab zombies or other alien life forms, what have you. However you die, that is meant to be a negative moment. That is meant to be a punishment, even. But it's not part of the story.
Blunders his way through and wins her favor. In the case of Super Mario 64, our hero's long and painful persistence eventually culminates with Princess Peach kissing him on the nose and promising to bake him a delicious cake.
Thank you, Mario. We have to do something special. Here we go! Listen, everybody.
And remember that in the narrative of this game, when he gets to this point, he has avoided death numerous times, gone through dangerous obstacles, but he has never died. The Mario who died, his story ended when he died, but this is not that Mario. And it's perfectly reasonable and possible to make it through to the end of a Mario game without dying. Just look for Mario no death runs on YouTube if you don't believe me. This is very, very disingenuous argumentation. Hey, Joseph was online. How's it going?
Buddy, let's bake a delicious cake for Mario.
Also, it's a kid's game. And while we could have an argument about the fact that Mario is expected to do all this to rescue the princess, do we really want to go into the paper-thin justifications for a lot of video game protagonists' motivations? I mean, to go back to Half-Life, Gordon Freeman is a scientist who gets shoved in an HEV suit and has no idea what's going on throughout the entire first Half-Life game. But he still ends up taking on both the US military and the invading alien armies, including going to the alien home planet. So, if your argument is that he went through all of that just to get a kiss on the nose and a special cake baked for him, and he didn't get any other reward, well, it's a kid's platformer. The reward is playing the game. If you really need narrative justification in your video games, maybe play something a little deeper than Mario, or don't expect that in your video games. As big a fan of and proponent of video games as I am, most of the time, the justification for your position and actions is pretty thin. And your reward for what you go through at the end is usually not really up to what you would have gone through. But the reward is playing the game. The satisfaction of having beaten the game. And most games don't even have an explicit reward for the character for having beaten the game. It's just, you saved the world. Congratulations. Good for you.
And of course, this trope of the male protagonist giving everything he has, including his own life, in order to win a bit of affection from a distressed damsel, isn't limited to just video games. You can readily find it in other forms of media as well, be that in movies, or comics, or literature.
Yeah, the damsel in distress trope is ancient. What? That doesn't mean that it doesn't serve to reinforce negative gender roles and stereotypes in the modern day. What's your point?
In fact, if you were to ask many women to name their favorite romantic movies, it is likely that a top pick among them would be the film Titanic. And how does Titanic end? With Jack freezing to death as he sacrifices himself so that Rose can go on to live a long and healthy life. Whenever you find a media representation of the damsel in distress,
At least he's not talking about both of them being able to fit on the fucking door. And yeah, the end of Titanic is Jack sacrificing himself so Rose can live. Sure. But it's kind of supposed to be a tragic love story. And I don't know how much apology I want to do for Titanic here, because it's an... I watched the Lindsay Ellis movie, and yeah, I think it's probably better than most people give it credit for. And Rose in that movie is much more active and self-realizing than most people give her credit for, despite the ending. But one of them had to die, and they set up in the framing device that she survived. So of course Jack was going to sacrifice himself. It's framed less in a male disposability and more of a sacrifices for love way. It's still a little bit male disposability. But what is the male disposability of fucking Superman? He sacrifices his life for the world, not for Lois Lane.
theme, it is challenging, if not impossible, not to also find the dude is disposable theme walking alongside her. So, yes, you'll find plenty of women getting themselves into all kinds of dangerous...
I love how he's framing this scene right here, which isn't a very good one anyway, as him sacrificing himself for Lois because he just rescued her and leaves her there. But he's doing this to save the world. Yes, Lois may be the humanizing factor so the audience can kind of get into that mindset. But he's doing this to kill someone who would otherwise destroy the world. So this is less an issue of damsel in distress. And again, Lois was less of a damsel in that movie than in many other instances. But this is definitely a case of, okay, I've saved the woman I love, now I need to save the world. And in doing so, sacrifices his life. So, heroic sacrifice is also a trope. What?
Predicaments almost everywhere you look. But in nearly every case, you'll also find men ready to dispose of everything, including their lives, in heroic attempts to rescue them and, perhaps, to earn a bit of their favor. But this kind of pressure upon men to sacrifice all in seeking for the favor of women isn't restricted just to imaginary media.
Yeah, he's assuming that every time a man tries to save, I mean that was not wanted, Taken, in which case he's trying to save his daughter, but he doesn't really try to sacrifice anything there. If anything, he forces the mooks who kidnapped her to sacrifice themselves to try to hold on to her. We're going to call that male disposability. I mean, let's talk about mooks in movies and video games and how, what is the value of a mook? This is fucking stupid.
It can be seen in the real world as well. For example, in World War I, British men who didn't want to enlist to go fight in the horrors of trench warfare found themselves being publicly shamed by women who would present them with a white feather, symbolizing their cowardice. The message was clear. Britain was under threat by German aggression.
See, he's conflating turn of the century gender roles, which were not good, with how feminists view media in the 21st century. That's vastly different. And it wasn't good back in 1915 when women would present men with white feathers to represent their cowardice, not go off to war. But that's all part of imperialism and nationalism and all these other negative attitudes that we could talk about. It has little to nothing to do with it has little to nothing to do with the damsel in distress trope. And the fact that women couldn't go off to war in there is a function of patriarchy. Because women were expected to be passive and homemakers and wouldn't do good on the battlefield because they wouldn't be able to kill anyone.
And that meant that British women were potentially damsels in distress.
Holy
it was the
shit.
duty of all young men to willingly sacrifice themselves to the war machine in their preemptive defense. Which brings us back to the point of this
No. How do you misunderstand world history like this? World War I was a clusterfuck of treaties and agreements between nations that ended up creating a terrible meat grinder which killed millions of people. Not to defend women, not to keep the women folk safe, not to save the woman, but because a handful of powerful nations had decided they didn't like each other and went to war with each other. World War I is not even close to a damsel in distress. Granted, a lot of propaganda would use the danger of the enemy getting to your women as part of their propaganda, but that was not the point of it. Again, we're talking about narratives here, and while the propaganda narrative was protect the homeland and the women and children at home, that's not what World War I was about.
video. The role of ideology in approaching media criticism. On the one hand, if you approach an entertainment medium, say video games, exclusively from the position of it being created within a patriarchal milieu, you will be inclined to frame everything in terms of how it harms or diminishes women. But on the other,
I like how there are definite examples of men sacrificing themselves in movies and video games for women, which could be construed as male disposability, but they're generally viewed heroically because of the context, but he's not using those. He's using examples of very obvious damsel in distress tropes and how those same media have men who die or who put themselves in danger. This is a very, very limited look at media and also a complete misunderstanding of how feminists interpret media through the patriarchal lens.
If you regard the same media exclusively from the perspective of how it portrays men, you'll find yourself on the other side of the looking glass. You may even start to regard media and society as primarily gynocentric, in that men are constantly encouraged to sacrifice everything they have in the service of earning the favor of women.
Yes. That is also a facet of patriarchy. It's like you know nothing about how third wave feminists actually interpret media. You just see Anita Sarkeesian bitching about damsels in distress on some Thunderfoot clip anthology, or hear Sargon bitching about feminists complaining about the patriarchy and think, yep, that's what feminists think. No, I guarantee that there's discussion about male disposability even in feminist spaces, because it's a real thing. Just like the damsel in distress trope, male disposability is a trope. But it's not used as often as you're making it out to be. Typically because they can engineer any kind of time a man is supposed to die as a heroic sacrifice.
However, because the ideological extremes of patriarchy and gynocentrism are mutually exclusive,
they're not.
We know that both things can't be right. And
they can.
Hence, we can observe people polarizing into their respective ideological camps, each one trying to score points and hoping to win the Oppression Olympics and prove that their side,
ding, 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 Oppression Olympics, this is dumb,
is the right one. My contention is that neither extreme position is correct, because neither position gives due consideration to it.
See, the problem is that he's treating this as a dichotomous extreme, where we've got patriarchy on one end of the spectrum and gynocentrism on the other, when patriarchy includes the idea of male disposability, that men are expected to sacrifice for the good of the society or for women or what have you. This isn't really a dichotomy. This is a false dichotomy.
To its necessary complement. The damsel in distress and the dude is disposable theme are two sides of the same coin. They don't exist independently, but rather
they totally can exist independently.
Tandem, with each side representing a sort of a distillation of the gender roles we often observe in society. The real question shouldn't then be which one is right, but rather why these tropes exist at all. Are they, as some postmodern gender feminists may contend, purely social constructs? Or are they perhaps inspired by a reflection of biological necessities? But that conversation is something...
Wow. Okay, yeah, we're done here. This guy's a fucking idiot. Holy shit. The idea that men and women, that men are supposed to be disposable and women are inherently damsels in distress is so fucking stupid. Holy shit. This... God damn it. This idea that women are damsels are biologically predisposed to be damsels in distress is fucking ludicrous. And this idea that men are biologically predisposed to sacrifice for women or for society or whatever is just as ludicrous. There's no evidence, there's no sacrifice gene on the Y chromosome. Just as there's no helpless damsel gene on the X chromosome. What biological imperative would lead someone to have those traits? Notice how this is where he ends it, where he just is like, but you're not ready to have that conversation. Okay, dude. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Shut up. Yeah, this is not a biological thing. This is a social thing. So, yeah. This is a completely stupid waste of time. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment because it helps me. Subscribe and ring that bell to help you. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.